Wild West, a period characterized by lawlessness and rapid expansion in the United States, was a time when punishment often took swift and brutal forms. Settlers sought to establish order in a chaotic frontier, leading to methods of punishment that were both a reflection of the harsh environment and a testament to human ingenuity. This video delves into 15 of the most severe punishments that were meted out during those tumultuous times. Number 1. Hanging. Hanging, by far one of the most well-known and widely practiced forms of capital punishment in the Wild West, bore its grim mark throughout the era. While it was a method adopted from earlier times, the circumstances surrounding hangings in the Wild West added a unique layer of gravity to its practice. Due to the sprawling nature of the frontier, law enforcement was stretched thin. This often led to the swift and sometimes hasty administration of justice. Public hangings became spectacles, events where the community would gather, perhaps not always out of a sense of justice, but sometimes morbid curiosity. The gallows would often be erected in the center of town or any notable public space, ensuring maximum visibility. While the intention was to deter would-be criminals with a very public display of the consequences of breaking the law, the atmosphere was at times almost carnival-like, with vendors selling food and children running about. Beyond the regular justice system, vigilante groups also employed hanging as their primary method of doling out what they considered justice. Without formal trials, these groups would capture those they believed guilty and execute them without ceremony. The line between lawful justice and mob rule was often blurred in the Wild West. Hanging stood as a grim reminder of the fine balance between maintaining order and the potential descent into chaos. Number 2. Flogging or whipping. The physical act of flogging or whipping, where the skin of the punished is brutally lashed with leather or corded whips, traces its roots to ancient civilizations long before the Wild West. But in the rough terrains of the American frontier, it took on a particularly severe role in the pantheon of punishments. The public nature of these punishments, much like hangings, was a testament to the society's desire to deter and shame the wrongdoers. Whippings were often administered for crimes that were considered serious but not grave enough to warrant death. Theft, fraud, or assault might result in a criminal being sentenced to a certain number of lashes, to be delivered either all at once or over several days. The number of lashes usually depended on the severity of the crime, the disposition of the judge or jury, and sometimes the mood of the crowd. Yet beyond the physical agony was the shame. To be whipped publicly was to be displayed as a wrongdoer, a person to be scorned and avoided. Families of the punished would often face ostracization, making life in the close-knit communities of the frontier even more challenging. Vigilantes, again overstepping the bounds of official law enforcement, also employed whipping as a tool of their rough justice. Their methods, often unchecked by any legal standards, could be especially brutal. While flogging and whipping might seem primitive today, in the context of the Wild West, they served as a grim testament to the challenges of maintaining law and order in a society where the boundaries of civilization were continually being redrawn. Number 3. Branding. Branding, while initially a method employed by ranchers to mark livestock, took on a darkly punitive role in the Wild West. Used as a tool for marking and shaming criminals, it was a punishment that left its mark not just on the flesh, but on the very soul of the individual, ensuring a lifelong reminder of past transgressions. The process was straightforward yet deeply unsettling. A metal brand, often crafted to represent a particular symbol or letter indicating the nature of the crime, was heated until it was red hot. Then, with dispassionate efficiency, it was pressed onto the skin of the convicted. The searing metal would burn through the skin, causing immense pain and leaving a permanent scar. Typically, brands were placed on areas that were visible even when clothed, such as the hands or face, ensuring the individual's crime was always on display. In certain areas, specific symbols became associated with particular crimes. For instance, a T might signify a thief, while an M could indicate a murderer. In more lawless regions, vigilantes took the liberty of branding those they deemed guilty, often without a formal trial or even substantial evidence. Branding's cruelty wasn't just in the immediate pain it inflicted, but in the long-lasting social and psychological implications it had on the branded individual. In a society where reputation was everything, and a fresh start was the dream of many heading to the West, being branded shut doors permanently, making it one of the era's most dread-inducing punishments. Number 4. Stockades and pillories. In the heart of many Wild West towns, one would often find a wooden frame known as a stockade or pillory, tools of public humiliation and punishment that predated the frontier era but found their continued use in these rough landscapes. These devices symbolized the community's collective disdain for certain crimes and emphasized public shaming over physical harm. A stockade was essentially a wooden board with holes carved out for the head and arms. The wrongdoer would be made to stand, their head and hands locked in place, rendering them immobile and exposed. They would be left in this uncomfortable position for hours, if not days, at the mercy of the elements and the townsfolk. Passers-by could, and often did, throw rotten food, mud, or worse at the person, while the more compassionate might offer a sip of water or shade. Pillories, meanwhile, were slightly elevated structures where the convicted would be clamped standing, their hands splayed out, and their faces available for public view and scorn. This elevation not only increased visibility but also intensified the discomfort of the position. Often these devices were used for crimes deemed morally reprehensible but not severe enough for corporal or capital punishment. Adulterers, fraudsters, or those guilty of public intoxication might find themselves facing such a sentence. Stockades and pillories, in their stark simplicity, served as a powerful reminder of the collective moral code of a community. The Wild West might have been lawless in many respects, but these devices showed that societal norms and the consequences of violating them were very much alive on the frontier. Number 5. Ear cropping and nose slitting. Among the more gruesome punishments of the Wild West era, ear cropping and nose slitting were both visceral and symbolic in their application. These punishments, originating from ancient customs and previously used in various cultures worldwide, found their way to the American frontier as stark representations of retribution and shame. Ear cropping involved the removal of a part, if not the entirety, of a person's ear. Often, a knife or sharp blade would be employed to cut away the flesh, causing immediate and searing pain. The aftermath was not just physical disfigurement. The act was symbolic, marking the person as a wrongdoer for life. Such a visible mark often led to immediate identification as a criminal, with all the social stigmas and challenges attached to it. Nose slitting was equally, if not more, harrowing. It involved making incisions or even cutting off portions of the nose. Like ear cropping, the pain was immediate, and the resultant disfigurement was lifelong. The nose, given its central position on the face, is impossible to hide, making this punishment particularly severe in its social consequences. In a time and place where reputation was everything, ear cropping and nose slitting weren't just about causing physical pain. They were about marking an individual, branding them for life, and ensuring their past deeds would never be forgotten or forgiven. Number 6. Tar and feathers. Of all the extrajudicial punishments that found a place in the annals of the Wild West, tarring and feathering stands out for its sheer theatrical cruelty. Rooted in medieval Europe's practices, this humiliating form of mob justice saw its revival in the Americas, used as both a means of retribution and public shaming. Beyond the immediate physical torment, the individual would then typically be paraded around the town or left in a public space, forcing them to endure the jeers, scorn, and ridicule of onlookers. The removal of the tar was a painful process in itself, often leading to skin coming off or lasting scars. While the act might seem bizarre by today's standards, its symbolism was clear to the people of the time. The tar represented the stain of their perceived crimes, and the feathers emphasized their outcast status, marking them as different and disgraceful. Tarring and feathering was not reserved for hardened criminals. Often, it was used against individuals who went against popular opinion or were seen as threats to the community's values. It could be a fate that befell outspoken journalists, unpopular politicians, or anyone deemed to have overstepped societal boundaries. In the chaotic environment of the Wild West, where the line between justice and revenge was often blurred, tar and feathers became a tool for communities to assert their values and maintain order, albeit in a particularly savage and unforgettable manner. Number 7. Chain gangs. In the vast expanses of the Wild West, where infrastructure was still in its infancy and manual labor was a valued commodity, the concept of chain gangs emerged as a particularly effective means of punishment and resource exploitation. These groups of prisoners, chained together, were forced into grueling labor, often in the most challenging and dangerous of environments. Chain gangs were an embodiment of punitive labor. Shackled together by their ankles, prisoners had to move, work, and rest in unison. The chains that bound them served multiple purposes. They prevented escape, forced teamwork, and were a constant, clinking reminder of their incarcerated status. However, the conditions these prisoners endured were often inhumane. Injuries were common, and medical care was minimal at best. The chains that bound them caused sores and infections. Overseeing guards were not always just in their treatment, with many instances of brutality and unnecessary punishment documented. While the idea behind chain gangs might have been rooted in notions of rehabilitation and community service, the reality was far bleaker. These men, and occasionally women, found themselves in a relentless cycle of hard labor and degradation, their freedoms curtailed not just by prison walls but by the very chains that bound their feet, forcing them to tread the hard path of the Wild West's unforgiving landscape. Number 8. Vigilante justice. Amidst the rugged terrains and unsettled territories of the Wild West, where law was often a distant concept and formal justice systems were still taking root, vigilante justice rose as an immediate and often brutal response to perceived wrongdoings. Vigilantes, self-appointed guardians of morality and order, operated outside the confines of the law, delivering what they saw as swift and necessary justice. Vigilante groups often emerged in areas where official law enforcement was either absent or deemed ineffective. The lack of structured judicial systems, coupled with increasing crime rates, drove ordinary citizens to take matters into their own hands. These groups, driven by a shared sense of duty or vengeance, would hunt down, capture, and punish those they believed to be criminals. The methods employed by vigilantes varied widely, but they were almost always characterized by their ruthlessness and speed. A common scene might involve a suspected horse thief or murderer being dragged from their home in the dead of night, hastily tried by the group and then executed, often by hanging, before dawn. The absence of a formal trial process meant that evidence, witnesses, and defense were luxuries rarely afforded. Furthermore, these groups sometimes grew in power and influence, challenging official authorities and creating power dynamics that threatened the very fabric of the emerging Western society. Vigilante justice, with its raw immediacy, embodies the tumultuous spirit of the Wild West. It speaks to the challenges of establishing order in a new frontier, the thin line between justice and revenge, and the often dire consequences of taking the law into one's own hands in a land where the rule of law was still finding its footing. Number 9. Keel hauling. While keel hauling is more commonly associated with maritime punishments during the age of piracy and naval discipline, tales of its use did occasionally surface in the contexts of riverboats and other waterbound settings in the American frontier. Keel hauling, by its very nature, was one of the most brutal and terrifying punishments, a near-death experience intended to leave a lasting impression on both the victim and the onlookers. On riverboats in the Wild West, while the barnacled undersides of ocean-faring ships might be absent, the act's sheer terror remained the same. Here, the rapid currents and muddy waters added their own layers of peril to the punishment. Beyond the immediate physical torment, the psychological trauma of keel hauling was profound. The uncertainty of survival, the choking sensation of being dragged underwater, and the sheer helplessness of the situation left survivors traumatized, often for life. However, it's important to note that the instances of keel hauling in the Wild West were rare and largely anecdotal. Its origins lie firmly in naval tradition, and its employment in the frontier territories was not a common occurrence. Yet tales of such extreme forms of punishment, whether factual or embellished, serve to underscore the lawless and harsh nature of life during this tumultuous period in American history. The very mention of keel hauling was enough to invoke fear and deterrence, making it a dark legend in the chronicles of frontier justice. Number 10. The Blood Eagle, myth or fact. The blood eagle, an alleged Norse method of execution, has long been a subject of fascination, horror, and debate. Vividly described in some of the Norse sagas, it involves the victim being placed prone, the ribs severed from the spine, and the lungs pulled out through the wounds to form wings on the back, supposedly representing an eagle. The visceral imagery associated with the blood eagle has made it one of the most debated and controversial topics among historians and scholars. There's no historical evidence to suggest that the blood eagle was ever practiced in the Wild West. Yet, as tales from the Old World traveled with settlers and were shared around campfires, they mixed with the local lore. The line between fact and fiction blurred, creating a rich tapestry of myths, legends, and half-truths. As for the blood eagle itself, its veracity remains hotly contested. While certain sagas provide detailed descriptions, there's a lack of definitive archaeological evidence. Some scholars argue that the ritual was a poetic metaphor or a result of misinterpretations. Others believe it might have been a real but exceedingly rare form of punishment or sacrifice. The Wild West, with its own share of brutal punishments and grisly tales, became a fertile ground for stories from other lands. The blood eagle, while not a part of the West's reality, serves as a reminder of how tales of cruelty, whether fact or fiction, can captivate the imagination, travel across time and space, and become woven into the fabric of diverse cultures and epics. Number 11. Pressing with heavy stones. A punishment that stands out for its sheer simplicity and cruelty, pressing with heavy stones, known technically as peine forte et dure, traces its origins back to medieval Europe, but found its way to colonial America, and its shadow would linger into the era of the Wild West. The concept was straightforward but terrifying. A person, typically accused of a crime and refusing to plead either guilty or not guilty, would be laid down, and heavy stones or weights would be placed upon their chest. With each refusal to give a plea or provide information, more weight would be added, slowly crushing the person beneath. The intent was twofold: to extract a plea and to serve as a public spectacle, demonstrating the unyielding weight of the law. One of the most infamous instances of this punishment occurred during the Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts, when Giles Corey, accused of witchcraft and refusing to enter a plea, was pressed to death over 2 agonizing days. His resilience and the cruelty of his execution left a mark on the public consciousness. The brutality of pressing with heavy stones speaks to the lengths societies have gone to maintain order and extract justice. In the vast expanse of the Wild West, where the line between law and lawlessness was often blurred, the tales of such punishment served as chilling reminders of the extremes of human cruelty and the lengths to which people would go in the name of justice. Number 12. The Gauntlet. The gauntlet, a punishing ritual with roots in various cultures, found its own unique manifestations in the tumultuous expanse of the Wild West. The essence of the gauntlet involved the punished individual running or walking between 2 lines of people, each of whom would strike, whip, or hurl insults at the individual as they passed by. It was a physical and psychological trial meant to punish, humiliate, and serve as a deterrent to others. Indigenous tribes of North America had their own versions of this ritual. For some tribes, it served as a rite of passage for young warriors, testing their endurance and resilience. However, in the context of punishment, it was sometimes employed for offenses deemed detrimental to the tribe. Offenders would be forced to run through 2 rows of their peers, enduring blows from sticks, stones, and fists. As settlers expanded their territories and clashed with native populations, they often witnessed or heard tales of these tribal customs. Over time, the concept of running the gauntlet began to be adopted and adapted within settler communities. For the settlers, it was less a rite of passage and more a method of public humiliation and punishment. Criminals, particularly those deemed traitors or spies, might find themselves forced to run through a gauntlet of angry townsfolk, facing a barrage of blows and insults. In the backdrop of the Wild West, where establishing order was a constant challenge, the gauntlet emerged as a tool of collective justice. The community, acting as both judge and executioner, delivered swift and public retribution, emphasizing communal values and the price of transgression in a land where survival often depended on trust and collaboration. Number 13. Dunking stool. The dunking stool, often also referred to as the cucking stool or ducking stool, was a particularly infamous instrument of punishment, predominantly associated with witch trials and public humiliation in colonial America and Europe. Its appearance in the legends and tales of the Wild West offers a glimpse into the ways earlier traditions and fears traveled westward with the pioneers. The apparatus was relatively simple. A chair or stool was affixed to a long wooden lever, which was then mounted on the edge of a pond or river. The accused would be strapped into the chair, and with a push, they would be dunked into the water, submerged for a few agonizing seconds or longer, and then lifted out, only to be dunked again. The process was repeated multiple times, each dunk a traumatic blend of fear, asphyxiation, and public humiliation. By the time tales of the dunking stool reached the settlements and towns of the Wild West, its direct usage as a punishment was waning. However, its symbolic resonance as an instrument of mob justice, superstition, and cruelty persisted. While the stool itself was less commonly employed in the frontier, its legacy influenced the ways communities responded to fear and the unknown. Tales of women being accused of witchcraft and subjected to the torment of the stool served as chilling reminders of the darker aspects of human nature, even on the frontier. In the narrative of the Wild West, the dunking stool symbolizes the transplanted fears and prejudices that settlers brought with them, a dark relic from a past that even the vast open landscapes of the West couldn't fully leave behind. Number 14. Riding the rail. In the lexicon of American frontier justice, riding the rail stands as a stark symbol of mob-driven punishment and public humiliation. The phrase conjures up vivid images: an unfortunate soul, often tarred and feathered, straddling a rough wooden rail hoisted on the shoulders of two men, paraded through towns or communities as onlookers jeered, insulted, and occasionally struck the victim. The punishment of riding the rail was as much psychological as it was physical. The rough-hewn wood, usually a fence rail, was not kind to the human anatomy, and being forced to straddle it caused intense discomfort and pain. However, the real torment lay in the spectacle of it all. Those forced to endure this punishment were usually individuals the community felt had transgressed its norms or values in some way. Their public parade on the rail was a potent message. This is the cost of crossing the community. This form of mob justice was not unique to the American West. Its origins can be traced to earlier periods in American and even English history, where it was used to punish perceived community wrongdoers, ranging from unfaithful spouses to corrupt officials. However, as settlers moved westward, they carried with them this form of rough justice. In the vast landscapes of the frontier, where formal law enforcement could be scarce and the rule of law tenuous, community-driven punishments like riding the rail became a means of maintaining order and dispensing immediate justice. In the tales and legends of the Wild West, episodes of individuals riding the rail often underscore the broader themes of the era: the tension between lawlessness and order, the power of community sentiment, and the rough, immediate justice that often prevailed. While it was but one of the myriad forms of punishment and retribution in the West, its theatrical and public nature ensured that it would be remembered, a symbol of the trials and tribulations of life on the frontier. Number 15. Lynching. Among the most heinous and notorious forms of vigilante justice in the annals of American history is lynching. Its dark shadow looms not just over the tales of the Wild West, but also across the broader American landscape, symbolizing the devastating intersections of race, justice, and mob mentality. While the term itself can refer to any extrajudicial killing by a mob, it is most commonly associated with racially motivated hangings, especially of Black Americans in the South. However, in the context of the Wild West, lynching had its own set of grim nuances. Back in the Wild West, while racism certainly existed, especially towards indigenous and Mexican populations, the motivations behind lynching were often different, driven by immediate concerns of crime and community safety rather than an overarching racial agenda. Nonetheless, the act itself remained a grim testament to humanity's capacity for violence and retribution. The legacy of lynching in the Wild West is complex. On one hand, it reflects the brutal realities of frontier justice. On the other, it serves as a precursor to the more racially charged lynchings that would stain America's history in the years to come, a haunting reminder of the costs of unchecked mob justice and prejudice.